The aim of the Tricycle Theatre's Great Game Festival is to help understand Afghanistan's history and its tensions, tribal and cultural, and foster debate about the West's involvement there. The Tricycle has form on this method of working on Northern Ireland, Iraq and Darfur. Director Nicholas Kent commissioned 12 plays by writers including Siba Shakib, Abby Morgan and David Edgar, which have been moulded into a trilogy. They run alongside a film season, talks, exhibitions and music. Gemma Redgrave and Raymond Takaram are amongst the cast.
Well, last time I was home, I went out with him and a couple of his pals. You should have seen the looks on their faces. But they asked me if I'd met Saddam Hussein. Straight up.
I had the idea about a year ago because I thought that the media and the arts were very preoccupied with Iraq and had hardly spent any time at all looking at Afghanistan.
The grace of God!
I commissioned 12 playwrights to give us a chronological history of Afghanistan since the West's involvement. So the plays start at the first Anglo-Afghan War in 1842, right through to the present day. The last section starts with a play which deals with the American neglect of Afghanistan, really, and a CIA operative trying to get more involved because he sees what's going to happen with the Taliban. Then, after that, we have a play by Richard Bean looking at NGO involvement in Afghanistan. Following that, there's a play about education, and women's education particularly.
You sent her 6 years ago.
I have the old forms that Ara used to register. But it is important if you want to re-register.
It was Ara who signed them. Ara wanted her to go to school.
Well, first wasn't what I was expecting at all.
The very last play of the sequence is Canopy of Stars. It's set in Helmand Province, and it's about a sergeant on an observation post talking to one of his new privates there who's just come up the line.
No details, Sergeant.
No. Safer, eh?
And it very much summarises what I was trying to do with the whole programme, to open up a debate as to whether we should be in Afghanistan, what we're doing there, and how long we'll remain there.
Michael, does a festival like this add to understanding and have the capacity to change views?
Absolutely. When I arrived at the Tricycle Theatre in the heart of Brent with Vanessa Redgrave in the audience, I thought, oh my lord, this is going to be a nightmare. I couldn't have been more wrong. The 2 hours that I spent in the theatre were a revelation because you had essentially a group of playwrights and a director collaborating broadly from the sort of centre-left consensus that you get in publicly subsidised theatre, and what they did is they looked honestly at the issues about our intervention in Afghanistan. No one can watch us and conclude anything other than that we are right to be involved. Yes, there are huge moral issues around the way in which NGOs are operating in a fraught environment, around America's neglect in the past of those people whom we should always have been supporting. But this set of plays, I think, is excellent. The last play in particular, the play which features 2 British soldiers and one sergeant's dilemma in particular, really stands out. I haven't seen on television or on the stage a sympathetic portrayal of British soldiers, I think, for years. And it's the first time you actually see soldiers not as victims or villains, but as, well, the only exception I can imagine. It's the only time you see them actually in control of their destiny and defenders of their actions.
Sarah, for you, did you think the narrative thread was strong enough, or was it quite disparate?
No, I thought it was really good. I watched all the plays, and it was very, very interesting to go through Afghan history and then end up on the last night with more contemporary stuff. If you wanted, I mean, I just thought it was stunning that this was done at all, that in London today you could have a whole season of theatre about Afghanistan. And it really was Afghanistan 101. If you knew nothing about Afghanistan and you wanted a seminar on Afghanistan, you could watch all the plays and you'd know really a lot about it. I particularly, on the last night, the ones I particularly liked were the ones about the 2 about girls' education and aid working, because that really resonated.
And also the compromises that NGOs have to make.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the moral relativism kind of thing, which is really important in Afghanistan. There's one scenario where the teacher is trying to sign girls up for the school, and another one where girls end up being sold, in effect, in exchange for land rights. And that is exactly what Afghanistan is like. I mean, all these plays were immaculately researched.
Do you try to do that?
Yes, I was involved in trying to set up a school in the north of Afghanistan, and we had a situation where they'd agreed that girls would be able to study there, and then the school was built on that basis, and then the villagers turned around and said, oh, there needs to be a very high wall around the school, so only boys are being allowed to study.
Johan?
I think you're both right that the ambition of this is just brilliant, and the Tricycle is such an ambitious theatre. It's this tiny little place in Kilburn, and it is their window on the world, and it's wonderful. I do think, though, we have to admit that it's more of a mixed bag than perhaps you're both presenting. There are some really terrific plays and some real duds. You definitely do get a sense of the tracking of Afghan history. You know, Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And you do get a sense of that, these themes re-emerging through the works of different people. But I think the problem is, a lot of the writers, even very good writers like Abby Morgan, are trying to make themselves into columnists. They've written polemics, very straightforward polemics. And actually, polemic is almost the opposite of drama. A polemic makes you certain, drama makes you uncertain. And there are only a few plays that I thought really explored the ambiguities. That terrific one about the aid workers, David Grieg's play, A Miniskirt That's in Kabul.
Which is
Fantastic exploration.
Great,
yeah, looking at Najibullah, the guy who ran Afghanistan under the communists for a period, who you really get a sense of the ambiguity. This guy was a thug, he was a torturer, but women were free under his regime, yet things were somewhat better than what followed. You really get a sense of the kind of tortured ambiguity. If you're not confused about Afghanistan, you're not paying attention.
I was going to say, I think the only thing that you haven't mentioned is there was a cumulative aspect to this. So I only saw part 3, and I kind of came out, I thought it was wonderful. I came out wishing I had seen the other parts, simply because all these plays, which are very different, and I don't agree with you, I don't think the ones I saw weren't patchy, they were all very much of a standard.
Yes.
They all had an effect on each other, so seeing one play next to another, seeing those different textures and completely different attitudes and voices had a cumulative effect, so that I was very moved by the final Canopy of Stars, which you were, but I think partly because of what I'd seen over the 2 hours.
And what did you make of the verbatim, which is very much the Tricycle, and they did that with Stephen Lawrence, they did it with Iraq, when Richard Norton Taylor...
I thought that before. They were very effective.
Well, it underlines to me one point, which is that the arguments that the character who plays Richard Holbrook was Richard Holbrook's arguments are almost the sort of the centre of the evening. They're the arguments by which you're supposed to be most convinced, and I was. And I just thought to myself, those precise words, almost verbatim, could have been delivered by Paul Wolfowitz. Yeah. But if you'd had a character playing Paul Wolfowitz, the audience would have greeted those arguments with scorn. So, in a way, of course, the trend of the evening is in one direction. But along the way, of course, ambiguities are there in your mind. Of course, there are questions you ask.
But did you
and
have
I think the play that we all thought was
Yeah.
the best by Richard Bean about NGOs does that exquisitely. And again, the reason it does it is that it does make it clear that we are right to be involved, but it lays bare the way in which organisations that we tend to see as saintly are in fact deeply morally compromised
Michael,
entities.
It's really interesting that you're reading into this, that everyone would agree that we're right to be there. I actually think the plays are much more ambiguous about that. For a start, running all through the plays is the absolute stupidity of our second biggest mission there, which is the war on drugs. We are committed to destroying 60% of the Afghan economy. It's crazy. No country will ever welcome you if you're committed to destroying 60% of their economy.
Yes, I agree, and actually that just made me think of an example about this sort of ambiguity in Afghanistan, which is there was a governor in Helmand who was a notorious warlord and drug lord baron who was a friend of Hamid Karzai's, and he kept a lid on schools, you know, functioning in the area. His house was raided. They found 9 tons of opium there. Even in Afghanistan, he lost his job. And consequently, under the new person, now the Taliban have burned down schools, kids aren't going to school in the area, opium production has gone up by 2/3. And it really is the sort of horrendous compromise people have to make.
But finally, is that the problem, that in the end, we in the West don't really understand how society works in Afghanistan? We're trying to impose Western ways of working on essentially a much more complex society than we understand.
I thought the strength of all of these was we weren't ever being told what to think, or I didn't feel I was. And I actually think I think it's a miracle that none of these plays did seem like columns to me. They all had complexity and felt like proper rounded plays. And it was a crash course. It was a seminar, as you say,
really
in a
was
good
a
way.
seminar.
In a
Yeah.
totally good way. I need one.
Well, despite the fact the Taliban are resurgent in some areas of Afghanistan and life is still far from easy for most women, with Hamid Karzai now under international pressure not to ratify a law legalising rape in marriage, a pop idol-style show, Afghan Star, has braved the wrath of the more conservative elements of Afghani society to bring a singing competition to national TV.